Welcome back to Aussie Arvos. Today we're here with my GQ Patrol. Now last time you guys saw the car, I was making this bull bar up, and today we're going to have a bit of a run through on some of the accessories I've added since, as well as some of the maintenance that comes with living with a 34-year-old car. So, as you guys may have noticed, I got a bit of a problem when it comes to cars. Now one of the things I get asked a lot is when you're using a car as a weekender, what are some tips and tricks you can use so that when you do want to use your cars, you can jump in, turn the key and take it for a spin. Now, it doesn't matter if it's a modern car or something from the 80s, if it's a four-wheel drive or a street car. These things, if you leave them sitting around for years or even months at a time without doing the proper maintenance, these things will fall apart, and it'll mean that when you do go to use them, your day's going to be ruined by a lack of maintenance. So a great example of that is my VH. Now, if you haven't seen this car before, jump back to an earlier video, there's a full walkthrough on it. But basically, I built this motor when I was a lot younger. It's a Holden 6, it's all cast iron. This thing was sitting here through the middle of lockdown for probably 6 months. And it was a bit of neglect on my behalf. I was busy with the patrol and everything, and I just hadn't been starting the car at all. When I did come down here, I found that it had developed a coolant leak from the edge of the head gasket just in the time it had been not being driven. Never had a coolant weep there before, sat for months, just started weeping. So I ended up having to go through, literally take the whole head off and do a head gasket job on it, just like I did on the patrol. Sheerly through a lack of use. I know it's hard to believe, but it happens. So that leads me on to one of the first things, and it does seem pretty basic, but you do often forget about it. If you have a weekender that you're not using, at least when you can, make the effort to go out and start the car at a bare minimum, at least every couple of weeks. Just start it. If you can't take it out for a drive, just let it idle. Ideally, take it for even a short drive, just to get all the oil flowing around the diff and gearbox, keep everything lubricated, so you're not going to have issues with corrosion inside the gears and that sort of thing. If your car does have aircon, if you're that lucky, run the aircon for a little bit as well. That lubricates the aircon compressor, keeps all the seals good. But the main thing with running the cars is if it's a diesel with an injector pump, you want to keep everything flowing through that to keep it all lubricated. And if it's a petrol, whether it's carby or fuel injected, petrol goes off over time. Bit of a common mistake I've seen people make, and I've made myself, is the thought that everyone sort of assumes that 98 is a better fuel. Now, you will get more power out of it, but sometimes the additives in it mean that it will actually go off faster. I've had 98, and it may have just been from a bad batch, brand new from a servo, in a small motor, sat for 3 weeks, and I had to rebuild the carby. Completely gummed up, completely gone off. Now, if that had been something that was fuel injected, more modern car, obviously a huge job. So try and avoid those sort of fuel system problems. The easiest way is just to let the car run.
And if your car is sitting for a little while, is it worth still following normal service intervals for oil, or should I be changing my oil more than every 10,000 or 5,000?
Actually, that is a solid question. In my opinion, with these older cars, I don't think it's that much of a big issue. Where you tend to have that problem come in is with modern cars, due to oil types mainly. Someone's going to say this is wrong, but in my opinion, mineral engine oil doesn't go off, not in the timeline that it's going to sit in your car anyway. Now, if you've sat a car in a shed, in the back of a shed for 10 years, obviously you should probably change the oil before you start it. With modern cars, I think if you're really pushing past the service intervals, which they'll always have, they have kilometres or time. If you're really pushing past the time, it's probably not the worst idea to change the oil. It is cheap insurance at the end of the day, but it's mainly due to synthetic oils. So you'll find that obviously in modern motors. Any of these old things that just run full mineral oil, it's not really so much of a problem. But it is a good point while we're on the subject. If you are going to sit a car around for a long time, and it never hurts to check the oil and water. I mean, it's a minute to open the bonnet, pull the dipstick out, pull the radiator cap off, or check the overflow tank if you've got one, and just check your levels on everything before you start it, especially if you're going to go straight out of the shed for a long run. You don't want such a minor problem or a minor oversight to ruin your day. So those are a few general tips you can use to keep a car you're not going to drive every day or even every week on the road. Now, let's get into some of the maintenance stuff I've actually been doing on this patrol. So, maintenance on the old patrol, and it is something I want to talk about because it's a bit of a general consensus on the internet that these just don't need any maintenance. That you buy like a Land Cruiser or a patrol and it just keeps going and nothing ever breaks and it's all good. Now that is a fantasy, okay? This car's 34 years old. Now they are built solid, they are built tough, but parts fail, parts get old, At that age, things are going to start wearing out. It's done nearly 400,000 Ks, and things are designed to wear in a car, so things do need replacing. So as I have a tendency to do with cars, there's basically nothing in this engine bay I haven't touched or changed in some way. Basically went over every coolant hose. A lot of people tend to just use dam water as coolant. It doesn't really do too many wonders for anything made out of steel. All the barbs and everything on that were all corroded. Luckily I was able to scavenge some barbs off the donor motor that I used for the head, and so I kind of doubled up on everything there and had enough to get a good set. Heater hoses, which definitely something to have a look at. A lot of people will just change radiator hoses and think that done the top and the bottom one and that's it. Well, every other hose deals with the exact same amount of heat every time the car runs, and if it breaks, it's going to cause you the exact same problem, no coolant left in the motor. They are probably the most perishable part in your engine bay. Obviously anything made out of steel or aluminium isn't really going to wear out as quick, which leads me to electrical. Cabling, looms, all that sort of thing. Four-wheel drives are terrible for this. And I shouldn't say four-wheel drives, I should say past four-wheel drive owners, because people have a tendency to just throw wiring across places it shouldn't be, and it either rubs through other cables that are more important or rubs through the accessory wiring people have put in. Just bad installations in general. Conjuflex or split conduit like this is great, but used in the wrong place, it's also very good for rubbing through other things, so that's something to keep an eye on. But you got to remember that anything that connects from the engine to the body is susceptible to vibration and movement. So every time your motor runs, that hose is flexing, that hose is flexing, all the cables going from the battery, all flexing. And every time you start your car for a while, everything gets hot and cold. All that insulation on all that cable, definitely something to keep an eye on. Proper earthing is another good one. Probably one of the most common causes of electrical problems on four-wheel drives is bad earths. And you got to remember, and I talked about this when we did the stereo, whatever goes out in the positive has to come back in the negative. It is running a full circle. Everyone has a tendency to add all these 12-volt accessories to the positive. No one ever upgrades the earth. So you'll have, you know, something that was meant to run the starter motor and that was it. That was its peak load, and it was only designed to do that for 5 seconds. Now it's 30 years old and half crumbled apart because it vibrates with the motor. And then you add, you know, a couple hundred amps of accessories to it. It gets hot and it stops working. So one of the main things I did when I did the winch install was upgrade the earths. So make sure you've got a proper earth strap from your battery to your motor and also from your battery to your body. If you're running a winch, you've also got to run a proper earth for that as well. Another important thing to look at is the steering and suspension in your car. Now, as I mentioned when I was talking about hoses, they've all been replaced, the power steering hoses. They're again something to definitely have a look at. The condition of your power steering fluid will give you a bit of an indicator of the general condition of your power steering system. If you take the cap off and it smells burnt, like it will literally smell like it's been on fire, that's not a great sign. It means that something's been working too hard or the fluid just hasn't been changed in a really long time. You want to check all that for leaks as well, because obviously over time, steering leak will eventually drain that little reservoir and you will lose power steering, which when you've got wide tyres, makes you have a really bad day. The power steering box, I went ahead and upgraded that to a GU steering box. They are stronger in the sector shaft, meaning that they're less likely to shear if you slide into a rut and shock load the steering, something like that. So on that subject, I've also upgraded the drag link. Now that needed to be done when I did the steering box, as the GU steering box has a different taper. So I've got a GU rod end on one end and a GQ rod end on the other with a GQ drag link. That Nathan at Treadworks got for me, along with obviously the fulcrum kit that's in the car when we originally lifted the car. So that would be the next subject, is all your bushes and everything like that. A big failing part, as Patrick found, is suspension bushings that will obviously wear over time and kilometres. If you take a car that's been driven on the road its whole life by a grandpa, okay, and the suspension hasn't really articulated that much, now all of a sudden you load 500 kilos on it and expect the suspension to go to full articulation all the time, those things that might have been just hanging on for a long time are going to become a problem. It's a great idea if you have access to a hoist to get the car up on a hoist and just have a solid look over everything underneath and keep a keen eye out for any sort of different steering or driving pattern or knocks and clunks and that sort of thing you might notice. Don't just turn the stereo up because it's not going to get any better. Now brakes are another major thing to check over. I guess most common parts to fail quickly would be brake lines. These have been torn on four-wheel drives or whether they're just old in age and have perished like all your other rubber hoses. They are definitely something to have a look at before you go on a long trip, and if your car's this old, probably worth replacing. Calipers, now there's something you should also have a look at. The caliper essentially floats as you've only got pistons on one side on most cars, some have them on two. And when you have that floating caliper, every time you apply the brakes, the whole caliper body has to move across slightly as you've only got a piston pushing on one side. So that allows it to push on both sides. Those slides seize over time, especially if the car's been parked for a long period of time, meaning that you're then only loading one side of the disc. And they're a basic thing to check. Essentially, when you haven't got the brakes applied on the car, you should be able to move the caliper very slightly inside to outside. Take them apart, put a bit of grease on them, not normal grease by the way, and you will, again, improve the life of that part. So, that's the maintenance on the Patrol covered. Now let's get into some of the accessories. Alright, so one of the first accessories that went on the car after I built the bull bar was this GME 6.6 dBi antenna, which is paired with the GME XRS unit in the dash. I've also got a 2.1 dBi antenna for in case I want to go under the Montague Street Bridge. Now let's jump in the cab and check it out. So one of the cool things about the XRS unit is the actual unit itself is very small and you don't need to mount it where you can access it. So mine's mounted up under the dash, basically to the bottom of the head unit bracket, and then your handpiece you can just stick wherever's within easy reach. Now I'm going to pass this over to our resident radio expert who's going to give you guys a run through on some of the features.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty stoked Dan got an XRS because now finally I have someone I can share my location with a mapping tool, because like, yeah, it is just a UHF radio, but you can also do some other cool features. So yeah, you can, if you don't have cellular data or reception at all, me and Daniel can still share our GPS position via the radio. And I don't think that really gets talked about enough, but it is a pretty cool feature you can do only on XRS.
So, moving around to the back of the car, one of the most noticeable features is this new EMU wing. Now, as you guys know, I've been running the aluminium EMU wing on the driver's side of the car for like a year and a half now. And whenever we go camping, I basically live out of it. Like the fridge is on that side of the car, makes access super easy, so it was kind of a no-brainer to run one in this side. Now, my reasoning for going glass is that obviously from the driver's seat, the driver's side rear window doesn't affect your vision at all, but the passenger side will. Wanted to not make an additional blind spot. So yeah, these guys are now running a range of glass windows for just about anything. Makes access super easy. One of the great new features these guys have just come out with is this additional bracket up here. Now you can choose basically your accessories, but I've opted for a USB socket outlet and just your normal cigarette lighter socket. These are both switched with the wing, as well as this light up here. Now that's both got an amber light and a white light, depending on what mood you're in, I suppose. It also switches with the wing.
You said that they switch with the wing.
They switch with the wing.
So they only get powered when the wing's open.
Observe. On.
Oh, that's
off.
That's pretty fancy.
Like a factory fitted rear door.
Sick,
yeah, it is. It's really. It seems like a factory feature.
Yeah.
It ties in that well. So all you've got to do to that bracket is literally give it a power supply, and the rest is all done.
Where's the switch mechanism?
The switch mechanism's just back at the back of the hinge there.
There you go. I like that a lot. That's awesome.
Now, one of the other features that makes these look really neat, and give them what I think is a factory look, is the blackouts around the edge of the window. Now that hides the hinges and struts and everything so that you can't see it from the outside when the glass is shut. And as a little side point, I didn't know at the time what these little dots around the edge of your windows are for. You always see them on factory windscreens and that sort of thing. Why isn't there just a sharp line at the edge of the tinted section? It's actually to do with fatigue in the glass. If you have one section that's painted black and one that's clear, it's going to get more heat in the painted section. And if you had just a sharp edge, over time, you can get a stress fracture in that glass. So if you ever find yourself wondering that, which you probably never will, now you know. So for the next mod on the Patrol, I'm about to head over to Lamb and Patrick's right now, put the old Patrol up on the hoist and install this Black Hawk 4x4 Diff Breather kit. Now, what are Diff Breathers and why does your car need them? So, Diff Breathers, what are their purpose? Now, almost every differential or gearbox has a breather from factory. It has to by nature. We'll use a diff for an example, but the gearbox is basically the same. So in your diff, you've basically got, imagine a half full line through here. Well, there's your fill point right there. So that's your oil fill level. Everything above that is air. So you've got half air and half oil essentially in this chamber. Now, if you've ever thrown a plastic bottle in a fire, you'll know that as air gets hot, it wants to expand. That's what the diff breather's there for. As you drive down the road, your diff gets hotter than you might think due to the friction from the gear set and the bearings. Now that heat transfers into the oil and into the air inside the diff. That therefore needs to expand. Air comes out the breather. When you stop the car, it cools back down and the air draws back in the breather, keeping then no pressure inside the diff housing. If you do get pressure inside the housing, because you've either got a blocked breather or something like that, what you'll end up seeing, and I have seen it, is basically every seal in the diff goes at once. So your axle seals will be leaking oil, often your rear cover plate will be leaking oil, and your pinion seal will be leaking oil. That's not fun. But more so when you come to putting in a diff breather kit like this, what's the purpose? Now, as I mentioned earlier, the heat makes everything expand and want to breathe. When you put your four-wheel drive through a cold river crossing, that wants to immediately contract. So this thing's going to try and draw in any air it can. Now, if this breather here is underwater at the time, which it very easily is going to be, there's no air to draw in. So what's it draw in? Water. And you end up with a diff that instead of being half full of oil and half full of air, is half full of oil and half full of water. And that is going to ruin your day. So you're relocating that diff breather from either your diff housing or the factory diff breather point, which on this Patrol is essentially up on the chassis above the rear diff, or the front is brought up to here. We're relocating it to in here. So as I mentioned earlier, with the GQ Patrols, they do have a decent breather setup from factory, but it's not perfect. So the rear end is still just run up to the chassis rail. The front diff is run up to the firewall along with the gearbox and the transfer case. But it's not ideal, and something that I've seen fail a lot if you are doing this is this little hose right here, because it runs right next to the exhaust. And yet this is probably still the best diff breather setup you'll see on a factory car. A lot of modern vehicles, there's nothing. They will literally either run very low on the chassis or just at the diff themselves. So it's definitely something to look at if you're looking at doing any sort of wading through water. So this is the little Black Hawk breather right up here. Obviously, I'd hope above the waterline. You can plumb these into your snorkel or to your airbox if you want to. I've opted not to do that. I considered it. I might still do it at some point, but at the moment I haven't got a snorkel on the car, so there's not a huge amount of point to that. But I figured I've mounted it at literally the highest point in the engine bay. If there's water consistently up to this point, it means that it's pretty much above the dashboard. So I'm having bigger problems in the diffs at that point. So yeah, basically it gives you all the parts you need to connect to your factory diff breathers on the diff housings. You've got all the tubing and connections you need to run it up your car. Heaps of tubing, like I had heaps left over. You can run individual lines from your rear diff, transfer case, gearbox and front diff. I picked up on the factory front diff and gearbox and transfer case points and ran them into this breather just to get them that little bit higher and bring them all to one nice neat location. So what comes next? Because as we know, a good project car is never really finished. A few little things. I want to take this roof mounted water tank that I've made up and basically rejig it a little bit. I want to mount it inside the roof rack, which will give me room on the outside potentially to run a 270 awning similar to what Patrick's got on his 80, just to give me that full wraparound bit of weather protection for access to the back of the car and that when you're out camping. Obviously 12 volt stuff is just a continual evolution. I've already got a dual battery system in the car, as you may have seen, but there is potential to upgrade that in the future. As we've found, when you put an 1800 watt stereo in something, you do tend to flatten the battery pretty quick. Eventually I might run a rear bar on the car just to get a little bit more storage and take that 33 off the rear door. Also to run a bit of water storage in that, and fuel, as we know with the TB, is a bit of a necessity. Now, this is the one that is going to get people a bit upset. I have looked for some time for a red guard that matches this car that I don't have to paint, so I don't have to drill a hole in this one, but so far the search is coming up dry. Everything is either faded, or the paint's peeling, or it's just not the right color. So if you have one of these, I would very much like to see it, if it is in this condition. Otherwise, this one's might be getting a little bit of a snorkel sized hole in it, and there's going to be some negative comments about that, but that's okay because as we know, I don't care. So that's basically it for this week's episode. Hope you guys enjoyed seeing where the old Patrol's at and where it's going, and I will see you in the next episode.